to get started, depending on who you talk to, a lot of fisheries in the world are either fished at capacity or are overfished. And I said depending on who you talk to, because let's see if we can get the pointer going here. Ray Hilborn may disagree with Daniel Pauly. These are two prominent fishery scientists. Daniel Pauly will publish something that says, oh, the fish are, we're not going to have any fish, or Boris Worm will say, we're not going to have any fish by 2050. You probably remember seeing that in the news a few years back. And Ray Hilborn says, wait a minute, I looked at your methods. That's not right. So we're always doing better, I think, as scientists with assessments and things, but we can always do better in terms of management. So if we're not doing that well in management, how could we do better? And I think that we can do better in a lot of fisheries through co-management. And co-management is when, these are just some news articles I pulled off quickly from the internet, from not just some NGOs, but some popular ones and things. They've just picked up on some of the research. The co-management is basically, a simple way to look at it is shared management authority between communities or resource users and the state. The state could be the government, or it could be here, the state of Hawaii. But a little more nerdy definition, involves, how the rights to the resource are shared. And maybe an even nerdier definition is how the process is really more of a learning process on both sides. That it's not really about an outcome. It's about how you share these costs and benefits, and not just a management tool. So there's a lot of benefits, purported benefits to co-management, that it should increase collaboration and learning, improve regulatory compliance, empower the communities that are involved, reduce the transaction costs that are associated with fishing regulations and implementing a regulatory regime. And you can also combine traditional or customary knowledge with what many folks would consider to be, Western, scientific knowledge, to bring more data to bear on the problem. But there's always a but. Co-management is not a magic bullet. There's conflict. There's often conflict in communities. A community is not a homogeneous structure. If co-management is in place, the folks in the community may not benefit equally. The elites in the community may capture the benefits, or in a lot of cases across the world, a lot of women are disenfranchised or don't receive the same benefits that men do. It doesn't work for groups that are too small or too large. There's sort of a threshold for collaboration. I think it's about it's either 3 or 500. I can't remember which. It's about the limit for the size of a community. Bless you. One side may have too much power and not want to cede, authority to make it a true partnership, or one side may not be a willing partner. And we'll get to more of this in a minute. So, what does this have to do with Hawaii? Hawaii's fisheries and coral reefs in the main Hawaiian Islands, some research in 2011 has shown that compared to basically a pristine ecosystem, which would be Papahana or Mokuakea, the reefs and fisheries across Hawaii have been depleted about 50–60% of what they once were. And down at the bottom, you see a timeline there, and you can kind of put together some social events in your head. The little yellow increase there. Let's see, point one. This is apparently during World War II, when the beaches and fisheries were closed to the public. This is right here, around Western Contact after Captain Cook landed. So it's not just fishing, but it's all human impacts, land-based development, climate change, invasive species, and disease. So I've mentioned customary management or traditional management. In 1978, see, back up here. That's not all supposed to go in at once. I didn't think. 1978, a famous scientist got his doctorate here from the University of Hawaii, wrote this paper that said traditional marine conservation methods are gone. And this was in 1978, and then wrote in 2002 a completely different paper and saying there's a renaissance. These methods are being employed again and being used actively. Robert Johannes was his name. So in the 1970s, there was the Hawaiian Renaissance of language and religion and dance, and the voyage of the Hokulea, which is Malama Honua is going around the world now. But a lot of things changed in the 70s and 1970s, and traditional management was one of them getting revived. So how does that get to today? Well, today that traditional management is being manifested through co-management. So why look at Hawaii and co-management? There's like I said, the legacy of traditional management. These traditional practices are recognized in the state constitution, but it's part of the United States. It's multicultural, kind of straddles this developing world context. You've got the highly urbanized island here, and you also got some very rural agrarian communities on the outer islands. So there's about 24 highly engaged communities across Hawaii, but there's been 2 active co-management areas. There was one at Momomi and Molokai in the late 90s, and there's one that was just put in place in Haena, Hawaii in August of 2015. There's a lot of individuals that have been recognized as good leaders, which is something that people that study co-management say that you need. There's a pathway to do this. It's been in place for 22 years that allows communities to partner. But why aren't there more areas? So that's why I was interested and really wanted to take a look at this as a dissertation topic. So this is a really long-winded question here. But the first question is, how has coral reef fisheries management in Hawaiian Kingdom times changed to present day in terms of centralized management and co-management? How did co-management emerge at the community level in Hawaii? What are barriers to implementation? Are there any partnerships for communities to use outside of community-based subsistence fishing areas, which is Hawaii's defined co-management pathway? And what is the role of local leadership in co-management planning and implementation? So starting with the first question, I used this framework. It's called the Institutional Analysis and Design Framework to look at three different marine governance regimes: the Hawaiian Kingdom, contemporary centralized management, which would also include what Hanauma Bay out here. It would include bag and size limits. It could include anything that's going on around the main Hawaiian Islands, and then co-management, looking at the rules for Hana and looking at the rules that were in place at Momomi. And I also looked at how using a property rights framework to see which rights were shared, because co-management is supposed to be about sharing these rights and sharing authority. So in terms of data sources for the Hawaiian Kingdom times, I looked at a lot of different things: archaeology, oral histories, some Hawaiian historical research, and then in present day I looked at some legal analysis that's been done, as well as a policy analysis of contemporary fisheries regulations and the 2 co-management areas that have been in place. So here, I'm not asking you to try to read this text, but basically what I want to show, the IAD framework has, separates, decision-making authority to 4 different levels. And during the Hawaiian Kingdom times, there was a lot of, there's a pretty robust administrative structure in place, from the ruling monarch to a li'i on each island, and then a li'i at each moku or district. And then you'd have a li'i at an ahupua level as well. And then down at the operational level, which is where fishing rules take place, you would have a konahiki that was appointed. And basically the local resource rules were left to them to develop. They would have to pay tribute to chiefs at the higher level. But if they didn't do a good job, they could be ousted from their position or perhaps even put to death. And if you broke the rules, before the Hawaiian Kingdom started, but there was a time that if you broke the rules, you could also be put to death as well, or face a worse penalty in the afterlife. Today, this decision-making authority is shared only at the operational level. The other levels are just held by the federal government. That's all I wanted to show. So in terms of property rights components, there's 5 of them. There's access, the right to enter an area; withdrawal, the right to harvest, in this case going fishing; the right to exclude others from entering an area; management, which is being able to determine who's the first 3 rights; and then alienation, which is being able to sell or transfer any of those above rights. And then looking at those rights from the 3 systems, most of these rights here are held at the local level in the Hawaiian Kingdom, and most of these rights are held at the state level, whether it's co-management or centralized management. The alienation, although is subject to, in some cases, in the ceded lands, of course, to the rights of Native Hawaiians. So again, there's a pretty robust administrative structure. There was, the rights were devolved to local areas, and management they did a pretty good job managing fisheries. So in looking at the three different governance regimes, you can see that the rights are not being devolved to local communities and co-management, although there are some similarities in terms of the complexity of the administrative regimes. Also differences in efficiency, accountability, and outcomes. But I think that there's a lack of historical and cultural context in contemporary management, which leads to a lack of legitimacy in terms of maybe following the regulations. So getting on to emergence. This is a real nerdy figure. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it, but this area right here, this is supposed to be like how governance transitions occur from centralized management maybe to co-management, or from centralized management to ecosystem-based management. And so I'm looking at this area right here, the emergence area. And I used a mixed method approach. I interviewed 19 folks, did a policy analysis of some archival documents, a content analysis of some legislative testimony, and looked at management plans and evaluations of the co-management areas. And this is, for this particular part of the research, looked at a lot of folks that were involved on the state side, since this is supposed to be a partnership. A lot of the NGOs that work with communities, a few community members, but not that many. I get into that in the next section. A couple from federal government, academia, and consulting as well. So here are the results. You may have seen this in the newspapers here. I put this in here to show that I found that the drivers for co-management emergence were resource depletion and conflict. And here we have people from Oahu going to Molokai and a conflict occurring over local fisheries. And the social responses were self-organization, communities organized, they built consensus around a management plan, changing the rules, and they acted collectively to change the rules for their area and develop this process model as to how it occurred. The drivers are less fish in some places or perceive less fish, conflict, and although I have this laid out in kind of a linear fashion, this may not happen in a linear fashion. A community may self-organize and not build consensus. They may not get to this part. So these are some of the examples for one of the areas of self-organization. And this is like this part right here is like a subcategory of self-organization. So even though I was interviewing folks, there is sort of a rigorous method to it. You separate the data into themes, and then you build upon those. And if you have a lot of time or money, you can have someone else code it into themes and see if they get the same thing. So here is Hawaii's co-management process, but this is also the process for any rules, any administrative rules for any executive branch agency. As you can see, they're depending on, there's not all these steps you have to go through, but for co-management, they want you to go through these steps. The Division of Aquatic Resources does. So the whole point, not to try to read this, but you can see that, how many steps there are here that you need to go through. So the findings, what I would consider to be the key findings, one, the communities are very complex. Like I said, they're not homogeneous entities. There can be a lot of different interests, and it's hard to get people together and on board for one idea and to act on it. Co-management transitions can take a long time. Hyanna started their process, I think, depends on when you would start the clock, 10 or 15 years ago, and it was just passed in 2015. And I think that looking at some of the places that haven't been as successful, there's a big correlation between process legitimacy, making sure you really legitimately get everyone on board, and outcomes. And enabling conditions have to do with emergence that I mentioned. So here, the green areas are places. The green areas are places where there was co-management. There's Momomi. There's Hyanna. I would consider Kaho'olawe co-management, although that's a special area. And then the West Hawaii Regional Fishery Management Area has the Fishery Management Council there, which is sort of a co-management structure. And then the red dots are places where communities have introduced legislation and are interested in co-management but have been unsuccessful. Legislation didn't pass, things of that nature. Which gets into the barriers. What are the barriers to implementation? The methods were the same as the previous chapter, except I used the framework, the IAD framework, to look at transaction costs, which are basically the frictions of exchange or you may consider the cost of doing business. These are basically information costs that go along with changing management regime. And in asking people what these barriers were, 17 out of 18 people mentioned governmental structure and operations, that government was a large barrier. 13 out of 18 said there's the planning and decision-making processes, like that labyrinthine process figure I showed you with all the steps. A lot of it had to do with that. And what I thought was pretty interesting was that 10 out of 18 people a piece mentioned organized opposition from special interest groups and consensus building. Consensus building's at the community level, which is, like I said, it's difficult to get everyone on board. But I thought it was pretty interesting to look at to hear that people are actively working against this. And who is this? I had an idea from looking at some of the legislative testimony, but I didn't want to get into who said what or anything like that. I'd rather look at this kind of dispassionately. But going back to the figure here, there's 4 different opportunities for public input or obstruction, depending on which side you're on or how you look at it. So there are a lot of folks that know how to show up in meetings and disrupt them, and a lot of folks have cited this as being one of the things that made it really difficult to getting things passed. Even when there's folks from say another island would show up, another island completely about a small fishery that they were trying to change the rules for. And so I didn't want to get bogged down. It's really, unless you're a policy nerd like me, you're really not going to be interested in me going through the information costs, the coordination costs, the strategic costs, and when these things occur. But what is important, I made this figure to show that you're going to be gathering information, and that's going to be a cost no matter what stage of the process you're at, whether it's planning, you're designing the policy, you're implementing it, or evaluating it. You're going to be coordinating all the way up until evaluation. And in terms of transformation costs, these are just the implementation costs. This is kind of a fancy term to describe that. You have to work to get people on board, transform citizen preferences. You need funding to do this because planning takes time, and getting people to have meeting facilitators or rent spaces. Then you have to monitor performance and show that it's working. Regulate patterns of use, and then obviously enforce regulations. So the implications of this are that the costs, most of these costs, are being borne by communities and NGO partners, and not by the state. This is just kind of a way to pass off some of these management costs on other folks. So I think that there needs to be some extra work to streamline these transitions and to build public support. I think Hanauma did a good job with getting people on board and understanding what they were doing. We're not trying to stop fishing in the area. We just want regulations that are grounded in traditional practices. And again, managing conflict to avoid stalemates from occurring. Next, I wanted to look at some of the different marine management designations other than what I would call co-management, to see are there some different ways communities can partner with the state. Could these different management designations accomplish some of the same goals that co-management does? Could it make it easier on communities? So I analyzed all the different marine management designations. There's not 47 different designations, but there's 47 designations that are implemented across Hawaii. So I looked at and found 21 areas which have some level of community involvement, and then narrowed it down to 6 to do field work based upon some level of social and ecological success, some level of durability. The management designation's been there for a while. Maybe it's unique, like the NARS, the only marine NARS in the state, Hihi Kina'u, and the amount, or what we would say, subjectively, the quality of community involvement with the state. So I looked at 3 on Hawaiʻi Island, Milili'i, Ho'okena, and Hanauma. 1 on Maui, which is, one FMA on Maui. It's the only herbivore fishery management area, and that's Ka'anapale, Ka'akili. And then this is a marine life conservation district out here, but I looked at Pupukea Waimea. They actually allow some fishing. Some folks may not know, but they do allow some pole and line fishing from the bay. I think that they may allow some net fishing for Kule too. I'm not. Don't quote me on that. I have to double check. So I looked at six communities. This wasn't like a representative sample. This is a purposive sample. These communities are chosen for particular qualities. Again, mixed methods. Looked at legal statutes. Looked at the rules in place, and I also did 23 interviews with community members. And here's a picture of the beach and canoe at Ho'okena, and the Anakaline, how do you say the pools? The Anakaline pools? Or how do you? Oh yeah, I can never remember how to say that. Anyway, from Maui. And what I wanted to do was create something. I want to see, whether this was even possible to do co-management outside of the typical co-management pathway. So I looked at the fishery management areas. I looked at MLCDs, and I put all this. I analyzed them, and I shared them with the state, and they were convening a focus group of community members. And the community members said, well, this is not how we think about these things. We think about these things in terms of goals. They didn't have it in the words, limit or restrict access, but they said, what if we don't want boats? We think the boats are harming or interrupting the fish migration or harming the habitat. So if you just had that, for example, if you had that simple goal to just maybe restrict boating in one area, you can see all the different agencies that might be involved. Ocean, the DOBOR, DAR, OCCL. It could even potentially be the EPA. So it gets pretty complex, and there's a lot of different overlapping jurisdictions and agencies involved. But hopefully this can be kind of an institutional map for communities. But in the field work, communities were asked about how to improve community involvement, and there was 2 questions: how to improve community involvement, and how did they get the communities organized? I can't remember now. But there's 2 questions, which is why I didn't want to restrict how many suggestions people had. So that's why I got 115 comments from 2 questions, which would basically be 46. If they only said one thing, it would be 46 distinct answers. But I didn't want to limit. This is kind of like a brainstorming session. But the bottom line is, not to get too bogged down in the details, 90 of 115 comments had to do with community outreach and engagement, and the rest of them, talk about a few, sustaining their effort and patience and those sort of things. But folks were also asked what, in their eyes, was what they considered to be a success in their area, and a lot of folks said beneficial rules that still allowed fishing. It's a lot easier to get people on board, even if it's an herbivore or a management area, if they can still go and take other fish. Other folks said collaboration in itself was a success. And sometimes, the collaboration led to other unintended consequences, like improved watershed management. And they, folks thought the education engagement really paid off. And this is the I don't know, maybe Luna talked about this last week, the Makai Watch there in West Maui. So lastly, I wanted to talk about leadership, and here are a lot of folks that people may consider to be leaders, whether it's from business or political leaders, community organizers, peace activists. There's men and women here, but I think what's important is that these are all individuals. We often think of leadership in terms of one person, and that's the way that the academic leadership literature on co-management describes leadership. So I described two different sets of interviews that I've done so far in this presentation. I asked everyone about leadership over 4 years. So I completed 41 interviews, and they identified basically 6 different ingredients to good leadership and co-management. Access to resources, like an individual or a leader must have access to resources. They need to have knowledge of the resource system so that folks will take what they're saying as being credible. They need to be able to build trust with other people, because this is fundamentally about co-management's fundamentally about collaboration. They need capacity to guide like a democratic process in the community to build consensus. They need to have access to networks of relationships and ability to navigate those nasty bureaucratic and policy processes, like the figure that I've shown you a couple times. So I asked folks about all 6 of these areas. And I also coded the responses by different types of leadership. And there's leadership folks that don't have anything to do with co-management that have separated leadership into basically 5 different types. Personal is kind of like the individual leader, or positional, still sort of individual, but it says, you're leading by your position. This is like a political leader, probably. It can also be process-based, results-based, or purpose-based leadership. So back to the dimensions. I asked all 41 people about these dimensions, and 31 out of 41 people said that capacity to guide local level collective choice processes or democratic processes, that's over 75%, said it was really important. And no one of these ingredients or dimensions was mentioned less than a third, by less than a third of the folks. So there was pretty strong support for all of these different ingredients among those that I interviewed in co-management. And in terms of the leadership types and coding the different leadership types, I separated them into what I considered to be collaborative leadership versus individual leadership or results-driven leadership. So in what people were saying, in coding it by those leadership types, it seemed as though the collaborative model was the most, in folks' words, that was the most effective model for co-management. So what are the implications of these findings? I think that leadership is very important. There are folks that have said that leadership is not that important. I think it is. I just think it's different than the way a lot of folks think about it. I think that to be effective in what is essentially a process that involves collaboration, it needs to be a collaborative model. And in looking at those dimensions, I think that there needs to be some skill development for folks, and to develop, since it's not just about one person, you need to develop conflict resolution skills, facilitation and communication, negotiation, things of that nature. to be effective. So in conclusion, my 5 takeaway points would be, I think that the history and context really matter in designing regulations. That co-management is a process. It needs to be done the right way and take time. The transaction costs occur from planning all the way through to implementation. And more outreach and engagement, public education are needed at the community level. And collaborative leadership appears to be more effective than the individual model. And right on the dot at 3:45. I finished a little fast. We started a little late, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Very long process. Is there any one area or any one beach or any one island that seems to be successful up to now?
Hanauma, I would say Hanauma on Hawaii has been successful because they did the hard work. They met with everyone. They took their time, and it took a very long time. And so, like I said, having the realistic, having a long-term view of things, I think is necessary, because this is not going to happen overnight. No one is going to entrust you to manage fisheries unless you are able to, prove or show that, demonstrate that you know what you're doing, and that you're not acting alone. That you have, a community of folks behind you, or a lot of folks that do. So I would say that would be one place we'd look to, but there are others.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of a problem that worked? I've been trying all evening to really understand where it's going.
Sure. Well, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't mention, just getting into the problems of centralized management. But a lot of times, that people would say that centralized management, they're not receptive to.
Give me an area and a problem that you're talking about.
All of Hawaii.
I still don't know what we're talking about.
Fisheries management. So, yes.
Not collecting the fish, but harvesting the fish.
Harvesting the fish, the rules, the management regime, the whole enforcement, everything that goes into it is ineffective. So there needs to be, people need to work together. The folks that live near the fishery generally need to work together to improve enforcement. They can't enforce the rules, but they can report incident violations and high watch and things like that.
Would Molokai be an example of that?
They've sort of done it their own way.
I know, they've done it different ways.
But they are reviving their co-management application. So, I'm trying to answer your question. I think that this is about. This is a proxy for improving the fisheries, and the fact that it's almost like a lack of any management going on right now. So they're trying to bring more people together to improve it. What does that mean? It could be closing the area. It could be changing the gear that you use for fishing. Those sort of things. It could be changing the time of the season. Don't fish during spawning season, or things like that. So changing the rules, working together to change the rules for an area. Does that make more sense?
When you get finished with your doctorate and you get it all done, there'll be a report. Where will that report go?
It will go to online at ProQuest, which is where all dissertations go to be unread, I think.
I'm serious.
I am too.
There's so many of these
go
things
to the library. Do you go to the library anymore? Well,
Yeah, they will.
okay.
Yeah, they'll be in the archive in the library, but
A microphone.
Use it.
but how do
With some.
These individual chapters that I've shown, I've published the emergence chapter in a geography environmental science journal. I have another one in review in an open access journal. It's like a common pool resource management. So I'm going to try to publish each one of these in academic journals. So
have you considered sharing your information in a different way besides academic journals?
I think that's important. I try to, at the very least, share some of the findings. If something's getting published on Twitter or things like that. But I think always improve in terms of sharing stuff back to the community. I share anyone that I interviewed. I share that back. The end product with the folks involved. I share drafts with the folks involved to make sure that. And is this, it's the way I synthesize this, is this, what you said, or is this what's going on? And just give those folks an opportunity to kind of improve that before it goes through.
I'm sure you follow up with your interviewers too, if there's like talk story about it, informally versus formally, saying those kind of things too. It's really important to have that relationship between a researcher and the general public.
Is there different rules and regulations for fishing, both commercial and privately, in every bay and every harbor?
There are generally, for example, bag and size limits, how many you can take and how big the fish are, that are mostly uniform across, all the islands. Maui has different bag and size limits that were just passed. It took 7 years to pass those rules. There are rules that are specific to commercial fisheries. If you're a commercial fisherman, you have to report your catch voluntarily, of course. But the short answer to your question is yes. And then there's also these. This is it, out here. There's no fishing. This is a marine life conservation district. So I think there's 6 or 9 marine life conservation districts around Hawaii. So there are. And there's 47, like I said, marine management areas. There are 47 different areas. There's, maybe small areas. I think they comprise maybe 3 or 6% of all of Hawaii's coastline. So there's not a lot of areas that have special rules. Most of them are bag and size limits. These are things that are most uniform. And in the past, rules were place-based, and they may be different. They were the Konihiki would make that decision in consultation with the folks living there. So, yes.
You said at the beginning of your presentation that there was a threshold for co-management to be successful, right? So have you taken a look at how that works across the Hawaiian Islands? Do we meet that threshold or exceed it?
I don't think it would work in Waikiki. It's obviously not going to work in Waikiki.
That's what I mean,
I think it works in Hanauma because it meets that threshold of community size, and it's at the end of the road there. So there's not a whole lot of people coming in and out. I think that's why it may work in Molokai as well. There's you're able to sort of manage access there. That's why Mililiki may be a good candidate, and that's why they have their co-management area passed via legislation.
Have there been other ideas about management in the areas that exceed this co-management platform? Like, it was so successful in these pockets, but then that's only taking up, a whole other area to deal with it. Do you know anything about how it's
I think one of the biggest issues is enforcement, and there's
enforcing what's already
enforcing the rules that are on the books. And I think that you got to have money to enforce rules. We have, I don't know how we rank now, but I think we're somewhere 43rd or 47th in the United States in terms of aquatic resources and environmental spending. So we're really low in terms of spending, and I think people have to value, like division of land and natural resources, and value the environment to say, hey, we want to do better in terms of enforcing enforcing rules. You know, certainly you do better with enforcing rules around. They've been doing rotating closures, on Diamond Head that basically been shown to be ineffective. You know, they just have derby in the first 10 days or 2 weeks when it reopens.
It's ineffective?
Yeah. Yeah. And all the gains are gone in the first 2 weeks. And it's fun. It's sure it's fun to go fishing then because the fish aren't scared.
It's an hour.
Yeah. You know,
Really true.
and there's most people don't enforce rules at night either. You know, if you want to go and dive and lights and grab your fish, you can do that. You know. So
And that money, to follow on what you're saying, that money allocation is coming from what, voters at the community level or state?
there's also no
level?
marine. You're required to have a commercial fishing license if you're going to sell your catch, but there's no marine saltwater fishing license program.
So that's not
I think we're the only state in the United States that doesn't have one. I mean, maybe like South Carolina or something is the other one. I'm
But the
not
actual-
certain about that.
You said when I had asked about,
That provides
management.
money for management in a lot of places. Gathering data on people that go fish on fishery
in the enforcement of it.
and enforcement typically. Usually you charge somebody $25 or $50 a year to go fishing. Maybe I don't know how many people are fishing here, a lot. You know, that brings a lot of money for management.
So I think it's a little bit interesting that we rank 47 out of 50 states here. We're an island. And so all the landlocked land, I mean, are they bringing in money to their management through the same type of, like deer hunters in Montana? Are they bringing in the same kind of money that fishermen would be bringing in here? But maybe that's too broad or too far out.
We have hunting licenses here, but the people that enforce resource rules, they enforce rules from out by different guides. So, you may have, I think they have less than 10 people for all of Hawaii. And that's for, from Mount Waialae all the way to Poipu, or, to Honolulu, everywhere in between. So that's not that many people, and if you really wanted to enforce all the rules.
There's just not enough money coming in.
To enforce more
Through the
positions.
means- Through the means.
I'm from North Carolina, more or less. I lived there for 20 years, and anytime I would go out on the boat, I had a little wooden boat, would try to go fishing when I had time, and for flounder, little inshore species. Could not even go one time without having a wildlife officer pull me over or a fisheries person to say, "Oh, what'd you catch? Mind if I look in your cooler?" And so here, there's also you have to have probable cause to do that. So if someone were to take a bunch of undersized fish, someone would have to report it, and you'd have to have a reason to do it. It's not all doom and gloom, though. I think that we're on the cusp of doing a lot better. I think that there's a lot of folks collaborating to work on a fishing license program. We should raise some money.
There is no fishing license in this state, no.
Just the first one.
Just a freshwater license, yeah, and commercial
Yeah,
license.
commercial, yeah.
So a lot of folks who go fish just to catch fish to eat. There's not many people that I would say, go catch fish and release them. It's a lot more consumption oriented here than that. If you say recreational, you just say non-commercial here.
Well, it brings a lot of income, doesn't it?
It is a source of income, a big source of income.
It would be if they did it.
Yeah.
And they could maybe support a few more people. But what they're doing, as he points out, they go from top of the mountain all the way to 3 miles out.
Yeah.
And so, and how many people do you have? Not many.
Yeah.
And they're working 24 hours a day theoretically.
Well, one last thing, they had a community-based enforcement unit on the North Shore of Maui. They paid for one boat and I think 2 positions. And I think over the past few years, they've gotten up to over 90% or 95% compliance. But this is money paid through grants, I think by the Castle Foundation and maybe Conservation International. So You could do it if you just spend, if you were to spend a little bit of money. If you wanted to catch criminals, you would need police or detective units around, right? So I mean, it's not just that; it's also about education. I'm not just saying it's completely about enforcing rules and coercion. But people need to understand, a little bit better the connections and the importance.
That's what Hanauma Bay,
Yeah.
they're educating.
Right.
So it's a good education.
Absolutely.
But for the fishing part, it's completely, and it, just like he said, at night in Waikiki, the day that it opens, they're there before it opens. In fact, I have a friend that lives right there. She goes out swimming there all the time. She finds spear guns, and things of that nature. So
You can call DAR, DLNR, but they're not gonna come until ever, basically. So you can call them and report it and say, I just saw a couple guys go spearfishing when it's out of season or whatever, and, they might write it down, but unless you wanna go stop the guy yourself and hold him back, because nothing's gonna
I wouldn't
happen.
do that.
I
I think I don't want to. I think that I think DoCare is doing a good job, given the resources, and I think that people are reporting incidents. I'm sure Luna has probably talked about this, and it is making a difference having people involved. So.
Thanks.